B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to start on the last line of Daf Lamed Vav Omid Beis. Says the Gemara Tonu Rabbanon, Ein oifin pas over b'yom tov b'Pesach. One should not bake a very thick bread on Pesach, because the thicker the dough is, the easier it is for it to become chometz. Tivir Beis Shammai, that was the opinion of Beis Shammai. Ubeis Hillel Matirin, Beis Hillel say it's okay, there's no need for concern. The camo Passover. How thick is a thick bread that Beis Hillel say is still okay, and thicker than that, even Beis Hillel will agree one should not bake it on Pesach? Rav Huna tefach. Rav Huna says tefach. Where do we find tefach being a sort of guaranteed size that it's controllable, that it should not become chometz? Shekein notzinu belechem haponim. We find by the lechem haponim, the 12 breads that were changed weekly in the Beis Hamikdash, that since they were called lechem haponim, they had a face. The minimum size of a face is a tefach. Belechem haponim tefach, and we know that the lechem haponim was not allowed to become chometz. So you see that up to a tefach, you can be quite sure that you can control it from becoming chometz. More than a tefach, not. Maskef lo Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef is now asking a question against Rav Huna. Im omru b'zerizin, how can you bring me proof from the lechem haponim that one's allowed to make a dough on a regular Pesach of up to a tefach? By the lechem haponim, it was in the Beis Hamikdash with kohanim, and they were very meticulous of keeping all the halachas. They knew exactly how to take care and safeguard the dough from becoming chometz. Yomer b'sheinam's reason, you can bring proof from there to regular people making bread, doughs on Pesach, that even up to a tefach it will not become chometz. Im omru b'pas amela, and this is another refutation from lechem haponim. Besides for lechem haponim being amongst the kohanim, which were very meticulous with the halachas, by the lechem haponim it was pas amela, a very, very well worked on and toiled on dough. It would be pounded hundreds of times. And this is Gemara's elsewhere in Shas, how the lechem haponim was made. But there was much less risk of it becoming chometz. Yomru b'pas she'eino amela, you're going to say the same to regular dough, which has not been worked on that much. Im omru be'etzim yeveshim, the lechem haponim that was baked on dry woods, very dry, they would only cut the woods used in the Beis Hamikdash during the hot summer months. And anything that's baked on very dry woods gets baked much quicker, the flame is much hotter, and there's less chance of it becoming chometz in the meantime. Yomru be'etzim lachim, you're going to say the same applies to any regular person in his oven at home where the woods are more damp, that's also okay? Maybe such a thick bread being baked with woods that are not so dry will become chometz quicker. But in the case of the lechem haponim, where the ovens that were on all day, baking all the time for the different breads and different things that were baked in the Beis Hamikdash, and the tanur, the oven, was very hot, and the hotter the oven is, the quicker the bread will bake, the less chance it is of becoming chometz. You're going to bring proof from there that such a thick dough on a regular oven that's hot, cold, before it gets used now for baking the breads, also it's going to be guaranteed it will not become chometz. Im omru b'tanur shel mateches, in the Beis Hamikdash, the oven was a metal oven which gets much hotter, so maybe only there such a thick bread of a tefach could be used. Yomru b'tanur shel cheres, what are you going to say about a regular oven, that back in the days most ovens were made of clay, which is not as hot as a metal oven? So because of all these reasons, Rav Yosef says that Rav Huna brings proof that a tefach is up to a tefach, you can secure that it doesn't become chometz, is learned from lechem haponim. That's not a good enough proof that when Beis Hillel says one's allowed to bake a Passover, a thick bread, that indeed a regular thick bread on Pesach is allowed to be up to a tefach. Omer Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, she'ilis is Rabbi b'yichud. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said, I asked my Rebbe in private, who was Rabbi Yirmiyah's Rebbe? Umanu, who was it? Rav. Ikadamra, others say it was Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Omar Rav. It was Rav Yirmiyah said in the name of his Rebbe Rav, that his Rebbe Rav, She'ilis' Rebbe, asked his Rebbe B'yichud in private, Umanu, who was Rav's Rebbe, Rabbeinu HaKodesh, Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, also known as Rabbeinu HaKodesh. And what was the question that either Rav Yirmiyah asked Rav or Rav asked Rabbeinu HaKodesh? My Passover. what is this thick bread? And the answer was pas meruba. It doesn't mean thick bread. It means many breads. They were thin breads, but many thin breads together are called pas ova. Why would one call many thin breads a thick bread? Since you are going to bake many of these breads, even though each bread when it gets baked will be very thin, but when it's kneaded there's a very large dough. And since it's a large dough, it's called a pas ova, a thick bread. Another explanation, in the place where this Tana, this Braisa who says Ein oifin pas ova b'Pesach divir b'Shama b'Hillel matirim, in the place of that Tana, lepas meruba pas ova korule. When they had many breads in that place was called pas ova. And now the Gemara is going to discuss the reasoning behind this Braisa. If you say that we're talking about thick bread, the Masechet Pesachim Daf will be how concerned we are that it's going to become chometz. But now that we explained that it's talking about thin breads and it's just many breads, why would Beis Shammai say that there's an issue with baking many thin breads together? My tama imishum deka if it's because baking so many breads and each one is very thin is a lot of effort, and on Yom Tov one should not exert oneself beyond the minimum required effort to make the food one needs to make, then it's not a question in Hilchas Pesach, it's a question in Hilchas Yom Tov. So afilu b'Yom Tov nami. So why did the Braisa say ein oifin pas ova b'Pesach? It should be any Yom Tov, it should be asa. Says the Gemara, Nochanami, you're right. This Braisa was discussing, just that was the story. There was a question, it's now Pesach, it's Yom Tov, are you allowed to bake many thin breads? Beis Shammai said no, it's too much effort, and Beis Hillel said it was okay. But the same would be true on Sukkot, on Yom Tov, the same would be true on Shavuos. Tanya Namihachi, and we see a Braisa to this effect. Beis Shammai Omrim, Ein oifin pas ova b'Yom Tov. It says clearly that this pas ova, which we know now means that it's pas meruba, many breads, on a regular Yom Tov. It doesn't mention Pesach, because it's nothing to do with Pesach. Or Beis Hillel matir, and Beis Hillel say that it's mutter. And the main issue here was, the tircha is because we assume that you're not going to manage to eat so many breads on Yom Tov, and you're only allowed to cook on Yom Tov what you need for Yom Tov. So Beis Shammai says there's so many breads, then it's obviously an effort that you're exerting effort to make something, to cook something that you don't need on Yom Tov, and that is asa. And Beis Hillel say it's mutter, and in other places in Shas the Gemara discusses exactly what the machlekes is. Continues the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanon. Yoitzin bepas nakia, we're going back to the sugya of which breads, which types of matzahs is one allowed to use to be yoitz the mitzvah of Leil Seder be'erev toichlu matzos. So the Braisa says that if you have pas nakia, which is bread made of white or very clean flour, then one is yoitza. Ubehadra, and the same is true with flour that's not so clean, with coarse flour. Ubesrikin hametzuyorin b'Pesach, or with breads. There were types of cakes or types of matzahs that they would carve, or they would imprint an image into it, a decorative image. So these srikin, which were used, onto which they would design these images, hametzuyorin b'Pesach, you're allowed to use those matzahs with these designs on Pesach to be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. Even though they said that you should not really make these breads on Pesach, where you're going to have to take the time to carve an image, and the longer you spend on the dough before putting it in the oven, the greater the chances of it becoming chometz. And Omer Yehuda, Dovazeh Shoal Baisus ben Zoinim lechachomim. Baisus ben Zoinim asked the chachomim this question: Mipnei ma omru ein oisin srikin hamutzuyorim bepesach. Why should one not make these? One should not make these carved matzahs, the matzahs that have images graved on them on Pesach. Omru loy. And they said to him, because the woman who is baking the bread, the time that she's taking, she's delaying in order to make the image on the matzah, is going to be delaying putting the matzah in the oven. In the meantime, it will become chometz. So even though they said you shouldn't do it. If you had it and you made sure it didn't become chometz, you're allowed to use it for on Pesach. Omar Lohem. So Baisus ben Zoinim said to the Chachomim, Efsher ya'aseno b'tfus. If you have a tfus, which is a form, a type of a stencil with an image on it, and v'yikve'eno, and you can imprint, using the stencil, you can imprint the image onto the dough, kevon, in one shot. It takes just a second. That should be allowed. There's no delay involved. Omruloi. So the Chachomim said to Baisus ben Zoinim, Yoimru, people will say, Kol asrikin asurin. All these breads that are all people who engrave images onto the dough, it's asa. Usriki Baisus mutorin, and just these matzahs that come from the home of Baisus, so they had this stencil, mutorin is mutter. The Chachomim didn't want that people should say, everyone it's mutter, for you it's asa. We have to have one halacha for everybody. I was once following my father Tzadok lebeis Rabbi Gamliel, to the home of Rabbi Gamliel. They brought in front of Tzadok, they brought in front of him tzrikin hamutzuyorin b'Pesach, these matzahs that had engravings on them. Omarti, so Rabbi Tzadok said to his father, Abba, my father, Loi kach omru Chachomim, did the Chachomim not say ein oisin tzrikin hamutzuyorin b'Pesach? These decorated designs on the matzah should not be made on matzah on Pesach. Omar Li, so Tzadok said to his son Rabbi Lazar, B'ni, Loi, when they said it was asa, Loi shel kol adam amru. They didn't say that it's asa for everybody, for all the normal people, because normal people at home, they just put an image, they just decorate it very quickly and they couldn't really care how perfect it is. It's not a long delay. Elo shel nachtoimin. But when it comes to the bakers, those who are going to sell these matzahs with the images on, and they're going to be very particular that the images come out right, for them there's a risk of delaying putting the dough in the oven, and therefore it was asa. Elo shel nachtoimin amru. Ikud amru. Another version is the other way around. Hachik amar li. Lo shel nachtoimin amru. That they did not say it was asa to make these images, these designs for the bakers, because they had these stencils. All the bakers had the stencils, it was okay. Elo shel kol adam, but local private people who did not have these stencils, for them it will take them much longer to make these carvings, and therefore it was asa for them. Continues the Gemara, Oma Rabbi Yosi, Oisin srikin. These srikin, these matzahs that had these designs carved into them, one's allowed to do it kamin rakikin. If these wafers, or if these breads, these matzahs were very thin. Vein oisin srikin kamin gluskois. But when you have a matzah, or these breads which are like rolls, which are much thicker, and it's easier and quicker for it to become chometz, on there the Chachomim said you should not make these designs. Continues the Gemara, Tonu Rabbonon. Hasufgonin, the sponge-like breads, Vadufshonin, and the honey breads, V'iskeritin, and these wafers, these thin matzahs, V'chalas hamasoires, and pan loaves that were breads that were baked in a pan, not in an oven, V'hamaduma, or bread that was made with truma and chulin mixed together. In all these cases, pturin min hachala. They are not considered lechem. This is not the regular, we'll soon see, but this was not a regular way of making bread. Since it's not considered lechem, one is not chayav to take from this dough any challah. Asks the Gemara, my chalas hamasoires. What is this chalas hamasoires that we translated as a pan loaf? Omer Rabbi Shua ben Levi, ze chalut shel bali batim. These were the private homeowners when they would make bread using chalut, which is scalded flour, that they will see later on exactly what this means, but they would scald the flour before kneading it. And the balabatim, when they had this type of flour, they would not bake it in a normal fashion. We'll soon see how they did bake it. It was not baked in a normal fashion, and therefore it did not have the status of lechem and was potter from challah. That was the Brisa. Omer Shlokish. Shlokish says, Halolu, all the cases mentioned in the Brisa, from the Sufgonim and the Duvshonim and the Iskeritin and the Chalas HaMaseiris V'Amaduma, in all these cases, Meduma is a bit different because there it's not completely chulin and therefore there's no maisa. But there's no chiyuv challah. But all the others are maisa ilfasheim. The way that they would bake them, they would not bake it in an oven. They would bake it in a frying pan. And since they would bake it in a frying pan, then it doesn't have the status of lechem, and therefore they're not chayev challah. Rabbi, that was Rish Lakish, and it's important, we have to remember this for the coming sugya. Rish Lakish says that anything that is baked in a pan is not considered lechem. Rabbi Yochanan argues and says that Maisa ilfas chayovin, bread baked in a pan, is called lechem. V'halolu, and all the cases mentioned in this brisa that are potter from challah is she'ason b'chama. It was not made with a heat from a fire, it was made from the heat of the sun, and therefore it's not a normal way of baking bread, it's not considered lechem, and therefore it's potter from challah. Asks the Gemara Meisvei. We're now going to discuss this machlokes Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Hasuvgonin, in the brisa we saw, the suvgonin, va'aduvshonin, va'iskeritin, that it says explicitly in the brisa, asa'on be'ilfas, if you baked them in a pan, chayovim, they are called bread. Bechama, only bechama pturin. And this is clearly not like Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish said that the reason that in the brisa we mentioned before says that they are potter from challah is because they were made in an ilfus. So you see that the bread made in a pan is not called lechem. In this brisa it says explicitly it is called lechem, only if it's made in the heat of the sun it's not called lechem. Tiyufta de Reb Shimon ben Lakish. It seems to be a refutation against Rish Lakish, who says that ilfus is not considered lechem. Oma Ula. So Ula said, Omar Rish Lakish will explain to you as follows. Hacha, in the brisa, in this second brisa that says that Maisa Ilfas is called lechem, Hacha b'mayoskinon, because there's two ways of baking bread in an ilfas. You've got hirtiach ulebasayf hidbik. If you first heated up the frying pan very, very hot, and then ulesayf hidbik, you then stuck the dough onto the frying pan, because the frying pan was so heated up before you put the dough on it, it's very similar to an oven, and therefore it is considered lechem. If you stuck the dough onto the sides of this frying pan when it was still cold, and then hirtiach, you slowly heated up the frying pan, that's not a normal way of making bread. And in that case, that's what Rish Lakish said before, that Maisa Ilfas is not considered lechem. So then the Gemara is asking, if you're saying that when in the brisa, in the second brisa, that Rish Lakish says that Yochayev for Ilfas is talking about if you heated up the frying pan first, and we can learn from there, and we assume from Ula's words, we can take for granted that in the case where it was not heated up first, it is not called lechem, and it's not, Maisa Ilfas is not called bread, then hochanami de pturin, and that's the case that is potter. If so, adatoni seifa. What does it say in the seifa of this brisa? In the seifa, let's read the brisa again from the Meisvei. Hasuvgonin va'aduvshonin va'iskeritin asa'on be'ilfas chayovin. If you made it in a frying pan, you're chayev. And how did Ula explain that? That it's assuming that you heated up the frying pan first and then you stuck the bread onto it. So why does the Mishnah say b'chama pturin if you made it in the sun, not using wood to heat it up? And then you're potter. Say that even when you did it in an ilfas, you're potter if you put the bread into the ilfas before you heated it up. Adatoni seifa asa'on b'chama pturin. Why does the seifa of the brisa say that if you made it in the sun, the heat of the sun, it's potter? Liflek v'lisna b'didah. The brisa should say within ilfas it should make the difference. That b'mei dvarim amurim, when is it true that making bread in an ilfas is called lechem and it's chayev challah? Kagoin shirtiach ulebasayf hidbik. Only if he first heated up the pan and then put the dough in. Aval hidbik ulebasayf hirtiach, if he first stuck the dough onto the pan and then heated it up, pturin, it's potter. Why does the brisa deviate and say that potter is talking about when he heated it up in the heat of the sun, not the heat of the wood? Says the Gemara, this is what you have to read into the brisa. When is it true that when you make these breads on an ilfas that you're chayev, it's called it's called lechem sheritziach ol b'soif hidbik. If you heated up the pan before putting the dough into it. Aval hidbik ol b'soif hiritziach. But if you first put the dough in when the frying pan was cold, and then you heated up the frying pan, naaseh kamisha son b'chanmo. It has the same halacha as when you heat up these breads in the heat of the sun, not the heat of wood. And in both those cases, p'turin, it will be potter. Continues the Gemara Toshima. Yotzin b'matzah, you can be yotze the mitzvah of matzah. Yotzin b'matzah's hino. Hino is raw. Hino means a bread that's semi-baked, half-baked. So if you've got matzah that's not really baked properly, but nonetheless you can be yotze the mitzvah of matzah with it. Ubematzah hasuya be'ilfus, and you can also be yotze the mitzvah of matzah with matzah that was baked in a frying pan. So here you see clearly that ilfus is called lechem, and it's a question on Rish Lakish, who said before that Maaseh ilfus is not called lechem. In the same way as it's not called lechem for challah, it's not called lechem for lechem oini, for matzah. Answers the Gemara, Hochanami, this brisa that says that heating matzah up, baking matzah in a pan is considered lechem, must be sheritziach ol b'soif hidbik, that he first heated up the pan and then put in the dough. In that case, we said it's similar to an oven and is called lechem. Asks the Gemara, my matzah hina, what is this matzah hina? Omer of Yudam Shmuel, kol sheporosov ein chutin nimshachin himeno. If it's baked enough that when you break the bread, there are no strands that extend from it, then it's baked enough, and that's it. That's called a matzah that's semi-baked, that's half-baked. If there's still strands there, it's not baked, it's not considered baked. There's no more strands, it's considered baked. But obviously it's not been thoroughly baked. Nonetheless, it's called bread, and you are yotze the mitzvah of matzah with it. Omar Rava, v'chein lachmei toida. The same applies with lachmei toida, that as soon as they've been baked enough, that nikrumu poneo, that the surfaces of this bread have already become somewhat baked and they've become brown, and that's a stage of the baking, it's considered lechem, because the breads of toida also have to be considered lechem. And if the breads of the toida are that stage of being baked, that they're called lechem, and then the korban toida was shechted, then it's a kosher korban. If these breads of the toida that would accompany the korban, but if these breads are not yet called baked, they're not yet called lechem, they're not lachmei toida. And then if you shecht the korban, and you haven't got lachmei toida, that's going to be a problem. Says the Gemara Pshita. Of course, lachmei toida will have the same status as all the other things. Hilchas challah, hilchas matzah, hacha lechem ksiv, v'hacha lechem ksiv. It says lechem in the parasha of lachmei toida. It says lechem in the parasha of matzah. Why should it be any different? Says the Gemara, no. There's reason to believe that with lachmei toida, it needs to be even more baked, and it's not good enough that it's just called lechem. It has to be a sufficient and a significant type of lechem. Why would I have thought that? I may have thought, since it says in the pasuk, v'hikriv mimenu echod mikol korban, we know a korban toida had 4 different types of breads, of matzahs. 3 types, each of 10. 3 types of 10 breads were matzah. 1 group of 10 breads was chometz. 1 of each of these 10 were given to the kohen, the rest was eaten by the owners. So it says, "V'hikriv mimenu echod mikol korban truma l'Hashem lakohen azorik as dam hashlomim lo yiyeh." So the Gemara says, since it says "V'hikriv mimenu echod mikol korban," echod means it has to be a bread, a whole bread, a significant bread. I may have thought echod shelo yitel porus, and we learn from there that it's got to be a whole bread, not a broken bread. So v'hacha command the prisodomi. I may have thought, since it's not fully baked, it's similar to a part of a bread. It's not a whole bread, and therefore it would be an issue for lachmei toida. Komash malon? No. The halacha is, since it's been baked sufficiently that in other halachas it's called bread, it's called echod, and the korban toida is kosher. Continues the Gemara. The Gemara is now asking a question against Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said before that Maaseh ilfus, when you bake bread in a frying pan, it is called a lechem. Meisvei ha-meisa. Meisa is scalded bread. It's a type of scalding. We're going to soon see there's two types. There's one is me'isa, one is called shlita. So me'isa is a type of bread that was made when the flour was scalded. That means it came into contact with boiling water before it was needed. Beis Shammai poitrin. Beis Shammai say that dough made of this scalded, that the flour was scalded before it was needed, is not called lechem and is patur. Beis Hillel chayovin, and Beis Hillel say that it's chayav chala. Beis Shammai say that it's not considered lechem. Beis Hillel say it's considered lechem. Chalita, in the case another type of scalded type of dough, that means the flour was scalded before. We'll soon see the difference between the scalding called me'isa and that of chalita, but it's the other way around. Beis Shammai mechayvin, or Beis Hillel poitrin. Beis Shammai say it is called lechem, Beis Hillel say it's not called lechem. Asks the Brisa, Eze me'isa, Eze hu chalita. What's the difference between a chalita and a me'isa? They're both scalded. The flour has been scalded by both of them. What's the difference? Says the Gemara, the difference is that me'isa is kemach she'al gabe mugloshin, that they would pour the flour on top of the boiling water. Chalita is mugloshin she'al gabe kemach. Chalita is when you'd pour the boiling water on top of the flour. And we'll soon see why there should be a difference, if any. We'll soon see there's no difference between them, and the two first statements in this brisa are actually two different tanoim. One happened to be talking about me'isa, the other happened to be talking about chalita, but they both say there's no difference between chalita and me'isa, it's two different tanoim. Either way, the brisa carries on. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosi Omer, Nishum Oviv, in the name of his father Rabbi Yosi, Zeh v'zeh lifter. It doesn't matter if it's me'isa or if it's chalita, it is called potter. It's not called lechem, and it's potter. V'amri lo, others say, zeh v'zeh lechiyuv. There's no difference between me'isa and chalita, and in both of them it is called lechem and it's chayev. The Chachomim say, echod zeh v'echod zeh. It doesn't matter if you scalded the flour like me'isa or like chalita. It depends on how you baked it. Asan be'ilfus, if you baked it in a frying pan, potter. It's not called lechem. Betanur, chayev. But if you baked it in an oven, even though it was scalded, it's chayev. The very fact that it was scalded is not enough of a reason to say it's not called a lechem if it was baked in the oven. So before coming back to Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara wants to understand this brisa. V'tana kama, the first Tana. Ma'ishna me'isa, ma'ishna chalita. Why should there be a difference? Why the Tanakama do we say that me'isa, Beis Shammai say it's not bread, Beis Hillel say it is? Chalita is the opposite way around. What would be the logic in that? Omer Rav Yehuda ma Shmuel, v'chein Omer Rav Yehuda v'yiteimer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. They say the truth is k'machleikus bezu, kach machleikus bezu. That it's actually two mand omrim. And if the machleikus by me'isa and chalita is the same. If Beis Shammai say potter by me'isa, they also say potter by chalita. If Beis Hillel say chayev by me'isa, they say the same with chalita. V'tavra, and it's a contradiction. The first two statements are contradicting each other, and it's actually two different opinions. Mishe shanozu, lo shanozu. The very first opinion says, Ha-me'isa Beis Shammai poitrin and Beis Hillel mechayvin. What they mean to say is me'isa and also chalita. Beis Shammai say potter. It's from the kulei Beis Shammai, from the leniencies of Beis Shammai, or Beis Hillel mechayvin. The second opinion holds, Ha-chalita Beis Shammai mechayvin or Beis Hillel poitrin, and me'isa is exactly the same. Beis Shammai mechayvin and Beis Hillel poitrin. It's two different opinions, and there's no difference in halacha between whether you scalded the flour like me'isa or like chalita. But now the Gemara says k'tonimius. But now, finishing with this brisa, what does it say at the end of the brisa? V'chachomim oimrim. The chachomim say, echod zeh v'echod zeh. It doesn't matter whether it was scalded or not scalded, or it doesn't matter how it was scalded. She'ason be'ilfus, if you baked it in a frying pan, potter. It's not called lechem. But tanur, only if it was baked in an oven, it was chayev. Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan. This is contradicting Rabbi Yochanan, who says that when it's made in an oven, when it's made in a frying pan, it is called lechem. Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan will say, or the Gemara is going to try and answer, it's not going to work, but the Gemara is going to try and answer, Tanoihi, that Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, it's actually a machloikas tanoim, whether bread baked in a frying pan, whether it's called lechem or not. Titania, we learned in a brisa, Yachel Yeheime Isa v'chaluta chayovin b'chala. I may have thought, or would you think, that bread that was actually scalded, the flour was scalded before it was baked in any way, then it's going to be chayev b'chala. Talmud lo'ima lechem. It's only chayev chala if it's called lechem. This is not called lechem because this was not baked in any way. This was just scalded. It's, so to speak, it was cooked in the water. The flour was cooked in the water before it was baked. Rabbi Yehuda comes to the same conclusion. Ein lechem elo ha'ofui b'tanur. That lechem is only considered lechem if it's baked in an oven. So the Gemara asks Rabbi Yehuda, Hainu Tanakama. They both coming to the same conclusion. What's the difference between them? Elo lav. The difference seems to be Maise ilfus. Of course, if it was mo'iso chaluta, it was cooked, it wasn't baked. That's not called lechem. Of course, if it's been baked in an oven, that is called lechem. The question is, what about a case where you've got a maisa ilfus, which is a regular dough that was not baked in an oven, it was baked in a pan? What's going to be the halacha? Ikabenayu, that's what the Tanakama are going to argue with Rabbi Yehuda. Tanakama sova. The Tanakama hold that only if it's been cooked in the water, if it's me'isa v'chaluta, that's not called lechem. Maise ilfus, however, if you take dough and you bake it in a pan, chayovin, it will be called lechem. Rabbi Yehuda sova, and Rabbi Yehuda says that the only time that it's called lechem is if it's baked in an oven. And he holds sovar, maise ilfus pturin. If it's baked in a pan, it's not called lechem. So you see, you have a machlokes tanoim. Rabbi Yochanan, who says that maise ilfus is considered lechem, is like the Tanakama. And therefore, even though you had a question before from a brisa, Rabbi Yochanan will say, I'm following the Tanakama in this brisa. Says the Gemara, Loi. This brisa wouldn't really help us, and it could well be that both opinions in this brisa do not follow with what Rabbi Yochanan say, and they both say that me'isa and chaluta is not called lechem, and maise ilfus is not called lechem. The question is, if after that you bake it in an oven, does that help? The Kule Alma Maise Ilfus Pturin, they both say that Maise Ilfus is not called lechem. V'hocha v'hia kegoin shechozar, after it was baked, after it was either cooked or it was baked in the pan, chozar v'afoi betanur, he then rebaked it, or he baked it again in an oven. That's komiflige, that's the machlekes. The Tanakama sovar, kivan shechozar v'afoi, Tanakama says, since you rebaked it again, betanur in an oven, lechem korinon bei, it's called lechem. Rabbi Yehuda sovar, ein lechem, elo ha'ofoi betanur mikara. Rabbi Yehuda says it's only called lechem if it was baked initially in an oven. But when it was baked any other way before that, it's not called lechem. And then both opinions are not like Rabbi Yochanan. V'kiven del mikara lav betanur afyo, and since initially he baked this bread in a pan, lav lechem, it's not called lechem, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, Omar Rava, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. What would be the source and the reasoning for Rabbi Yehuda that says that bread is only considered bread if it was baked in an oven? The Chsiv, it says in a pasuk, Va'ofu eser noshim lachmachem betanur echod. And there is talking about an issue, a klola, that 10 women would be baking their bread in a single oven. So the Gemara learns from there, lechem ha'ofu betanur echod kori lechem. That bread is only called bread if it's baked in a single oven, which means that it's first baked in an oven. If it's baked some other place in an ilfus, in a different type of structure, and then put in an oven, it's not called lechem. However, if it's not baked first in an oven, ein kori lechem, it's not called lechem. Continues the Gemara. Yosef Rabbi v'Rav Yosef achoyrei Reb Zera. Rabbi and Reb Yosef were both sitting behind Reb Zera. V'Yosef Reb Zera kamei de Ula, and Reb Zera was sitting in front of Ula. Omar le Rabbi le Reb Zera. Rabbi said to Reb Zera, Boy menei me Ula, please ask Ula the following question. Hidbik mi bifnim. If somebody stuck the dough on the inside of an ilfus of a pan, v'hirtiach mi bachutz, and he heated up the pan from the outside, which is somewhat similar to what one would do in the case of an oven, then would Rish Lakish say in that case also that it's called ilfus and it's not called a lechem? Or will he say that in this case where he puts the bread on the inside of the pan and he heats up the entire pan from the outside, is that maybe there he'll agree that it's called lechem. Mahu, what's the halacha? Omar le. So Reb Zera said back to Rabbi, my emale, what should I say to Ula? De'i aminale, if I'm going to ask him your question, Omar li, Ula's going to answer me back, Hai niu, maise ilfus. This is maise ilfus. This is baking in a pan. And this is exactly the machlekes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish. If baking in a pan is considered lechem or not considered lechem, I have nothing to ask Ula. And then that was Rabbi asking Reb Zera to ask Ula a question. Now it's Rav Yosef's turn to ask Rav Zera to ask Ula a question. Omar le Rav Yosef le Rav Zera. Boy menei Ula, ask Ula the following question. Hidbik mi bifnim, va'avuka kenegdo. If you stuck the dough on the inside of the pan, but in order to save wood that was scarce for the poor people, they would make the flame on the inside. Somehow they would have the flame above the pan, and the flames would be directly onto the breads, and that way they would get baked. Mahu, what's the halacha? Is that a typical case of ilfus, which is a machlokes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, or will we say here everybody will agree it's more similar to an oven? Omar le. So Ula answered, Reb Zera answered back to Rav Yosef, my emale, what should I say to Ula? Di'a minole, if I'm going to ask him your question, Omar li, he's going to answer me, Roivani moisim came. This is how all the poor people, this is how they bake in their pans, and this is a typical case of ilfus, of using a pan to bake in, and this is the machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. There's no question here. And in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.